Hello again, and welcome to this video on the anatomy of the female reproductive system. I've decided to do the anatomy separate from the functions of the reproductive systems in both the male and the female, simply because the videos get way too long if we put it all together as one. So, same as with the male reproductive system, we'll do the anatomy of the female, and then the next video will be the functions of the female anatomy. Before we get into that, however, I would like to suggest that if you haven't yet subscribed, you'll get the opportunity at the end of this video. There will be a green gecko in a circle down here. Please click on that and you'll be able to subscribe to my videos. And I have a lot of videos in my mind. There's probably a couple of hundred of them that I will be posting as time goes by. Anyway, let's get into the topic just a little bit. I've pre-drawn a couple of diagrams on the board that are going to help me explain the female anatomy. We'll look at this one in a second, but I do want to remind you that both the male and the female anatomies are homologous. And I had this picture before. If you imagine this as a human torso and these as the gonads, as embryonic gonads, they're both connected to tubes that lead to the outside. And in the male, as we already realized, there's a ligament. It's actually called the gubernaculum, but that draws these, which would be the testes, and draws them to the outside because sperm develop at a lower than body temperature. In the case of the female, that doesn't happen. In the case of the female, the ovaries, which are the female gonads, they stay internal. You look at this diagram first, however, and it's pretty hard to represent the ovaries on this diagram because this is a sagittal section through the body, so it's cut through on this mid-plane. So right through here, I could represent a leg in the background, I suppose. Here, the leg would come down like that. So you get the idea. The parts of the reproductive system, there's actually three features that are worth identifying here. This is the vaginal opening here. This is the urethra. And this is the location of the clitoris. Now, all of these parts we get into discussing a little bit further along. The urethra, of course, is connected to the urinary bladder. And the vagina is a muscular tube which leads internally to the opening of the uterus. The opening of the uterus is called the cervix, but right now we'll just say uterus up here. So it's not a very brilliant diagram, but it's important to recognize that there's a couple of distinctions between the female reproductive system and the male reproductive system, just in terms of anatomy. First of all, we mentioned that the gonads stay internally in the female, but notice as well that the urethra and the reproductive tubes, they're not connected. In the male, the vas deferens hooks into the urethra. In the female, the two systems are totally separate. One other feature I can add to this is that these openings here are protected by folds of skin, and those folds of skin are called the labia. So that diagram, if I tried to represent the ovaries in here, they'd have to be represented in behind in here, something like that, but it's really hard to do on this diagram. So let's look at this other diagram, and we'll go around and represent the parts here. The uterus in this one is this. This is the vagina. I'm not representing the labia in this diagram at all. The ovaries, I'll just label this side here, ovary. This tube, both of them here, there's two names for them, called the fallopian duct or the oviducts. Fallopian tube, same thing. Interesting feature at the end of the fallopian tube, end of the oviduct where it is close to the ovaries, these finger-like projections And I've drawn this diagram in a cross section so that you can represent, like this, where my finger runs in here is technically outside the body because it's continuous with the outside. So this is outside the body, is a tube that runs in deep within the body. And these tubes, the oviducts, have actually got these finger-like projections on the end of them, and they undulate inside the body cavity. Those features are called the fimbriae. And what they do, quite simply, is their action causes a little bit of fluid motion and draws ova, once it's after ovulation, ova into this tube. So the ova would travel along the oviduct to the uterus, and if fertilization doesn't occur, of course, it passes out the vagina. So that's about it for most of the female reproductive system in terms of its anatomy. I want to focus a bit more on the uterus, however. Both the uterus and vagina are muscular organs, and I'm going to represent two layers in the uterus here. The outer layer here myometrium. Myo means muscle, so that's the muscle layer on the outside. Of course, it's up here too. It's all around. It's a pear-shaped organ, so it's all around that. The inner part here is an endometrium. And endo is a prefix. It means inner or inside. The blue line, or the location of the blue line, really is what we might represent, or might call a basal layer. I'm going to put that word up here just to keep it away from there. The basal layer is capable of thickening, and what happens quite simply is the endometrium becomes a thicker, blood-rich inner layer of the uterus. And it's this layer that gets shed during menstruation. But now I'm starting to talk a little bit about the functions of the female system, and all that happens after puberty, which is really the topic of the second video, so we're going to try and leave that alone. So there's really one more big difference here that has to be mentioned before we leave the topic. What we had with the male reproductive system is spermatogenesis as a sequence of events, or the maturation of sperm cells. It begins to occur with puberty because the hypothalamus secretes the hormones which initiate that process. In females, however, that's not the case. In females, it happens as an embryo. Let me try and represent that a little bit here. We don't need this diagram at all right now, or that one. What happens in females, as in female embryos, is up to about 7 months, the ovaries are active tissues, and really oogenesis, which is the process of the development of eggs in females, begins as an embryo. And like I said, it goes up to about 7 months at a time. In 7 months it stops. And during that 7 months, there are actually millions of oocytes are developed. Now oocytes, if you look at the word, this prefix oo, that means ova. So it's going to be egg cells is basically what that is. But there's millions of these things which are developed in the cortical region of the ovary. So the ovary, of course, has got an inner layer and an outer layer. The cortical region is the outer layer. So there's millions of these oocytes developed in the embryonic female. And these oocytes begin to undergo meiosis. So if we represent the oocyte like this, the cell which generates the oocyte undergoes mitosis, and as a mitotic cell, of course, it produces two cells. You can't use up the cells of the ovary, so one of these cells actually becomes the replacement cell of the original cell. So what we have here is this is the oocyte. That becomes the oocyte. And really what it is, we call it a primary oocyte. Well, it becomes the primary oocyte. I should go one step further here. Let me move this arrow here and put it this way. It begins to undergo meiosis. And it becomes the primary oocyte. So technically, I guess this would be the primary oocyte down here. The difference between the two is that these chromosomes in here, there's 46 chromosomes in here, they begin to organize themselves for cell division. And its cell division hasn't occurred yet, so it's still 46 chromosomes in here, but it's at what we call prophase 1. So it stops at prophase 1, which is very early on in the meiotic process. But the point is that at 7 months of age, when this stops, the female, not born yet, the female has all of the oocytes already starting to develop, all she'll ever have in her life. And there's billions of them. And the rest of that development occurs at puberty. So this activates again at puberty. I should mention another thing, there's something else going on in this whole process. These things become surrounded when their development stops. They can become surrounded by a certain type of cell. It's called a follicle cell. And the development of these occurs inside the follicles, and this whole unit then becomes a follicle, and this cell, the oocyte in here, develops within a cluster of follicle cells, and that continues on through its maturation as the rest of meiosis continues. So I think that sort of gets us ready for looking at what happens at puberty. Of course, we have to get into the hormone topic, and the female hormones are significantly more complicated than the male hormones. So like I say, if you want to subscribe, remember, there's my gecko, and there'll be another suggestion of a video that you can watch, and it'll be showing up here any second now. Thanks.